The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty training grounds of Fort Sentinel as Chen adjusted her pack for what she didn't yet know would be her final day in the Reconnaissance Specialist program. At 26, she had already endured 8 weeks of the most grueling military training the Army had to offer, and despite consistently ranking in the top 15% academically, she found herself constantly battling the skepticism of her instructors and fellow trainees. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The obstacle course stretched before her like a gauntlet designed to break spirits rather than build soldiers. Sergeant Major Williams, a weathered veteran with arms like tree trunks and a voice that could shatter glass, stood at the starting line with his clipboard and stopwatch, his expression already suggesting disappointment before Sarah had even begun. "Chen," he barked, his voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. "You're up. Time to prove you belong here, if you can." Sarah positioned herself at the starting line, feeling the weight of 30 pairs of eyes boring into her back. The other trainees, mostly men who towered over her 5'4" frame, watched with expressions ranging from indifference to barely concealed hostility. She had grown accustomed to being the outsider, the anomaly in a program designed for warriors who fit a very specific mold. The whistle pierced the air, and Sarah launched herself forward with explosive energy. Her smaller stature, which had been a constant source of criticism from instructors, suddenly became an advantage as she navigated the rope climb with agility that her larger counterparts couldn't match. Her legs pumped furiously as she scaled the wall, dropped into a combat crawl beneath the wire obstacles, and sprinted toward the final challenge. But it was during the navigation exercise that Sarah truly distinguished herself. While other trainees struggled with their compasses and maps, fumbling through calculations and second-guessing their decisions, Sarah moved through the terrain with an almost supernatural sense of direction. She had always possessed an uncanny ability to read landscapes, to notice subtle details that others missed, to piece together information in ways that seemed to defy conventional logic. "Time!" Sergeant Major Williams called out as Sarah crossed the finish line. He glanced at his stopwatch, his eyebrows rising slightly despite his efforts to maintain his perpetual scowl. "Chen, you just posted the second fastest time in program history." The murmur that rippled through the assembled trainees carried undertones of surprise and, from some quarters, resentment. Sarah allowed herself a moment of satisfaction before the familiar doubt crept back in. Excellence in one exercise didn't erase weeks of being told she didn't have what it took, that reconnaissance work required a certain type of person, and she wasn't it. The afternoon brought the weekly tactical briefing, where trainees analyzed real-world scenarios and proposed operational solutions. Sarah sat in the back of the classroom, her notebook filled with detailed observations and alternative approaches that she rarely voiced aloud. Experience had taught her that her unconventional ideas were often dismissed as impractical or overly complex. Captain Rodriguez, the program's lead instructor, clicked through slides depicting a hypothetical hostage situation in an urban environment. "The target building has 3 potential entry points," he explained, highlighting areas on the architectural diagram. "Standard protocol suggests a coordinated assault from the primary entrance while establishing overwatch positions on the adjacent rooftops." Sarah's hand shot up before she could stop herself. "Sir, what about the maintenance tunnels beneath the building?" The city planning records show an extensive network that could provide undetected access. The classroom fell silent. "Captain." Rodriguez's expression shifted from mild interest to visible irritation. "Chen, we're dealing with reality here, not theoretical scenarios from your textbooks. Field operations require practical solutions, not academic fantasies." The dismissal stung more than Sarah cared to admit. She had spent hours studying the architectural plans, cross-referencing them with municipal records and identifying patterns that others had overlooked. But once again, Her thoroughness was interpreted as overthinking, her attention to detail seen as a lack of tactical instinct. The breaking point came during the final evaluation exercise. Teams of 4 trainees were tasked with conducting a reconnaissance mission in the simulated enemy territory, gathering intelligence while remaining undetected. Sarah found herself paired with 3 of the program's most vocal critics, men who had made no secret of their belief that she was taking up a spot that belonged to someone more qualified. "Look, Chen," said Corporal Jackson, the unofficial leader of their group, as they prepared their equipment. "Just stay back and try not to mess this up for the rest of us. We know what we're doing." The simulated mission area was a sprawling complex of abandoned buildings and interconnected warehouses designed to replicate the challenges of real-world urban reconnaissance. Sarah's teammates immediately gravitated toward the most obvious approach, planning a direct infiltration route that would minimize their time in the field, but also limit their ability to gather comprehensive intelligence. Sarah studied the layout with growing concern. Her teammates' approach would certainly be fast, but it would also leave massive blind spots in their intelligence gathering. More troubling, she had noticed patterns in the placement of simulated enemy positions that suggested a more complex defensive strategy than her teammates were accounting for. "Jackson," she said quietly, "I think we're missing something. Look at the positioning of the sentries here and here." She pointed to locations on their tactical map. "They're not just guarding obvious approach routes. They're creating overlapping fields of observation that suggest they're protecting something specific in the northeast quadrant." Corporal Jackson barely glanced at her analysis. "Chen, we don't have time for your conspiracy theories. We stick to the plan." The mission began at 0300 hours under cover of darkness. Sarah followed her teammates through the predetermined route, her unease growing with each passing minute. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned, which in her experience usually meant they were walking into a trap. Her suspicions proved correct when they reached their primary observation point. What should have been a routine intelligence gathering position turned out to be completely compromised, with enemy forces positioned to detect anyone using the approach her teammates had insisted upon. The exercise ended in failure, with all 4 team members marked as captured or eliminated. During the debrief that followed, the instructors focused their criticism primarily on Sarah. "Chen," Sergeant Major Williams said, his voice heavy with disappointment, "your performance today confirms what we've suspected throughout this program. You lack the instinctive tactical awareness necessary for reconnaissance work. You think too much and act too little." Sarah felt the familiar burn of frustration in her chest. She had identified the exact problem that led to their mission failure, but because she hadn't been forceful enough in presenting her concerns, she was being blamed for the outcome. "Sir, if you look at my analysis of the enemy positions—" "Your analysis is irrelevant if you can't convince your team to follow it," Captain Rodriguez interrupted. "Reconnaissance specialists need to be leaders, not academics. They need to make split-second decisions based on gut instinct, not spend hours poring over theoretical possibilities." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. 8 weeks of sacrifice, of pushing her body and mind to their limits, of proving herself again and again, only to be told that her greatest strengths were actually fatal weaknesses. The official dismissal came the following morning. Sarah stood at attention in Captain Rodriguez's office as he read from her evaluation report. "Private Chen, while your academic performance has been satisfactory, your practical application scores and peer evaluations indicate that you lack the essential qualities necessary for successful completion of this program." The phrase, peer evaluations, particularly stung. Sarah knew that several of her fellow trainees had given her negative reviews not because of her abilities, but because they simply didn't want her there. The military's emphasis on unit cohesion, while generally valuable, had become a weapon used against anyone who didn't fit the expected mold. Your attention to detail, while admirable in some contexts, has proven to be a liability in time-sensitive operational scenarios, Captain Rodriguez continued. Effective reconnaissance requires intuitive decision-making and the ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. Your tendency toward over-analysis suggests you would be better suited to intelligence analysis roles rather than field operations. Sarah accepted her dismissal with the same stoic dignity she had maintained throughout the program. But inside, her world was crumbling. This had been her dream, her chance to prove that someone with her background and skills could excel in a field dominated by a very specific type of warrior. Now she was being told that the very qualities that made her excellent at gathering and interpreting information made her unsuitable for the job of gathering and interpreting information in the field. As she packed her gear and prepared to leave Fort Sentinel, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the military was making a mistake. She had consistently demonstrated abilities that went beyond what was being measured in their standardized evaluations. Her capacity for pattern recognition, her intuitive understanding of how complex systems worked, her ability to see connections that others missed, these weren't weaknesses disguised as strengths. They were genuine assets that the program's conventional wisdom couldn't recognize or value. The bus ride back to civilian life was long and filled with self-doubt. Sarah stared out the window at the passing landscape, wondering if perhaps the instructors had been right. Maybe she had been deluding herself about her capabilities. Maybe her unconventional approaches were really just academic overthinking dressed up as tactical innovation. 3 months after her dismissal from Fort Sentinel, Sarah Chen found herself working as a security analyst for Meridian Defense Solutions, a private contractor that specialized in providing intelligence support to various government agencies. The job was everything the Army had suggested she was suited for: analyzing data, identifying patterns, and producing reports that other people would use to make operational decisions. Her cubicle on the 14th floor of a nondescript office building in Arlington, Virginia, was a far cry from the training grounds where she had once dreamed of proving herself as a reconnaissance specialist. Instead of conducting field operations and gathering intelligence firsthand, she spent her days staring at computer screens, correlating information from dozens of sources, and writing summaries that disappeared into the vast bureaucratic machinery of national security. Sarah's supervisor, Dr. Patricia Vance, was a career intelligence analyst who had never served in the military, but possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of global security threats. She had taken a liking to Sarah's methodical approach and attention to detail, qualities that made her an ideal fit for the painstaking work of intelligence analysis. "Chen," Dr. Vance said, appearing at Sarah's cubicle with a thick folder tucked under her arm, "I've got something interesting for you. We've been asked to conduct a threat assessment for the upcoming International Energy Summit in Seattle. 3 days, 47 world leaders, and approximately 15,000 attendees from the private sector." Sarah accepted the folder and immediately began flipping through its contents. The International Energy Summit was an annual gathering that brought together government officials, corporate executives, environmental activists, and academics to discuss global energy policy. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. This year's summit was particularly significant because of recent geopolitical tensions and several high-profile terrorist attacks targeting similar events in other countries. "What's our specific focus?" Sarah asked, already noting potential security vulnerabilities in the preliminary venue layouts. "The FBI and Secret Service have the primary security responsibility, but they've asked for additional analytical support on emerging threats," Dr. Vance explained. "Your job is to look for patterns they might have missed, connections that aren't immediately obvious, and potential attack vectors that conventional security planning might overlook." Sarah spent the rest of the day immersing herself in the details of the summit. The event would be held at the Seattle Convention Center, a massive complex that presented numerous security challenges. The attendee list read like a who's who of global influence, making it an attractive target for any number of terrorist organizations seeking maximum impact from an attack. But as Sarah delved deeper into the intelligence reports, she began to notice something troubling. Most of the security analysis focused on traditional threat vectors, vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices, lone wolf attackers, coordinated assault teams. While these were certainly legitimate concerns, Sarah's training had taught her to look beyond the obvious. She pulled up architectural plans of the Seattle Convention Center and began cross-referencing them with utility maps, transportation networks, and surrounding infrastructure. What she discovered made her increasingly uneasy. The convention center sat atop a complex network of underground tunnels and service corridors that connected to the city's broader infrastructure system. More concerning was what she found when she started tracing the ownership and management of companies involved in the summit's logistics. Food service, security, cleaning, technical support. Dozens of contractors would have access to restricted areas of the venue, and their background screening had been conducted by different agencies using different standards. Sarah's analytical training kicked into high gear as she began mapping connections between seemingly unrelated data points. She noticed that several of the contracted companies had been recently acquired by holding companies with complex ownership structures. Following the money trail required hours of painstaking research through corporate filings and international business records. What emerged was a pattern that sent chills down Sarah's spine. 3 of the companies involved in Summit Logistics had connections, however indirect, to financial networks that intelligence agencies had previously linked to terrorist funding operations. The connections were tenuous, buried beneath layers of legitimate business transactions, but they were there. Sarah's pulse quickened as she dug deeper. This wasn't proof of anything yet, but it was exactly the kind of pattern that her instructors at Fort Sentinel had trained her to recognize. The problem was that her current role limited her to observation and analysis. She couldn't conduct field investigations or take direct action based on her suspicions. She documented her findings meticulously, creating a comprehensive report that outlined the potential threat vectors she had identified. When she presented her analysis to Dr. Vance the following morning, she expected to be praised for her thoroughness. Instead, Dr. Vance's reaction was lukewarm at best. "This is interesting work, Chen, but it's all very speculative. You're connecting dots that might not actually be connected. Intelligence analysis requires us to focus on concrete threats, not theoretical possibilities." The criticism felt depressingly familiar. Once again, Sarah's ability to see patterns and connections that others missed was being dismissed as overthinking. "But Dr. Vance, if even one of these connections proves significant, Chen, I appreciate your diligence, but we can't send the FBI chasing shadows based on circumstantial evidence. Your job is to provide actionable intelligence, not conspiracy theories." Sarah felt the familiar frustration building in her chest. She had learned to recognize this particular form of institutional blindness, the way organizations became so focused on established procedures that they lost the ability to see emerging threats that didn't fit conventional patterns. But Sarah had also learned something else during her time at Fort Sentinel. Sometimes the most important intelligence came from sources that others were inclined to dismiss. She decided to continue her investigation on her own time, using her security clearance and analytical access to dig deeper into the connections she had identified. Working late into the night, Sarah traced financial transactions, researched corporate histories, and cross-referenced personnel records with known terrorist databases. What she discovered confirmed her worst fears and revealed something even more sinister than she had initially suspected. The companies involved in Summit Logistics weren't just connected to terrorist financing networks. They appeared to be part of a carefully constructed infiltration operation designed to Place operatives in positions where they could access the venue's critical infrastructure. The timing of the acquisitions, the patterns of personnel changes, the requests for specific security clearances, it all pointed to a coordinated plan that had been years in the making. Sarah's hands trembled as she compiled the evidence. This wasn't speculation or theoretical analysis. This was a clear and present danger to thousands of lives, including some of the most influential leaders in the world. But she also knew that her track record of being dismissed as an overthinker meant that her warnings might not be taken seriously until it was too late. She tried going through official channels first, submitting an updated threat assessment that laid out her findings in stark detail. The response was swift and predictable. Dr. Vance called her into a private meeting and delivered a lecture about the dangers of analytical overreach. "Chen, I'm concerned about your objectivity on this case," Dr. Vance said, her tone suggesting that Sarah's career might be in jeopardy. "Intelligence analysis requires dispassionate evaluation of evidence, not dramatic leaps of logic. You're seeing conspiracies where there are probably innocent business relationships." Sarah tried to explain the significance of the patterns she had identified, but Dr. Vance cut her off. "I'm reassigning you to the North Korean missile program analysis. I think you need to work on cases where the threat parameters are more clearly defined." The reassignment was effectively a demotion, a signal that Sarah's analytical judgment was no longer trusted. But it also freed her from any official responsibility for the summit security assessment, which meant she was now operating entirely on her own initiative. Sarah knew she was taking a significant risk. If she was wrong about the threat, her career in intelligence analysis would be over. But if she was right and did nothing, the consequences would be catastrophic. She had seen too many intelligence failures that resulted from analysts being afraid to stick their necks out. Too many situations where the truth was buried beneath layers of bureaucratic caution. She decided to take her concerns directly to the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force, bypassing her own chain of command and risking serious professional consequences. The meeting was arranged through a contact she had made during her military training, an FBI agent named Michael Torres, who specialized in domestic terrorism investigations. Agent Torres listened to Sarah's presentation with the focused attention of someone who had learned not to dismiss unusual intelligence sources. Her military background and security clearance gave her credibility, but more importantly, the evidence she presented was compelling in its detail and scope. "Ms. Chen," Agent Torres said after reviewing her analysis, "this is extremely serious. If you're correct. But it's also extremely thin in terms of actionable evidence. We can't arrest people or shut down businesses based on financial connections and employment patterns." Sarah had anticipated this response. "Agent Torres, I'm not asking you to make arrests. I'm asking you to investigate. Put surveillance on the key personnel I've identified. Monitor their communications. Look for patterns of behavior that might confirm or refute my analysis." Agent Torres was quiet for several minutes, studying the documents Sarah had provided. Finally, he looked up at her with an expression that mixed skepticism with grudging respect. "Ms. Chen, in my experience, the best intelligence often comes from people who see things differently than everyone else. Your analysis is unconventional, but it's also thorough and internally consistent." He paused, making a decision that would prove crucial in the days ahead. "I'm going to quietly initiate some preliminary surveillance on the individuals you've identified. If we find anything that corroborates your concerns, we'll escalate accordingly. But I need you to understand that if this turns out to be nothing, it could have serious consequences for both of our careers." Sarah nodded, accepting the weight of responsibility that came with her decision to pursue the investigation. She had learned at Fort Sentinel that leadership sometimes meant being willing to take risks that others wouldn't take, to trust your instincts even when conventional wisdom suggested you were wrong. Over the next 48 hours, Agent Torres's Surveillance teams began monitoring the activities of the individuals Sarah had identified as potential threats. What they discovered sent shockwaves through the FBI's counterterrorism division and validated Sarah's analytical methods in the most dramatic way possible. The surveillance revealed a complex network of operatives who had indeed infiltrated multiple companies involved in Summit logistics. Intercepted communications confirmed that they were planning a coordinated attack designed to maximize casualties and global impact. The operation was far more sophisticated than typical terrorist attacks, involving simultaneous strikes at multiple points throughout the convention center complex. But the most chilling discovery was the attack's timeline. The terrorists planned to strike during the summit's opening ceremony, when the venue would be packed with world leaders and attendees. The intelligence suggested that they had been planning this operation for over 2 years, patiently inserting operatives into positions where they could carry out their mission with devastating effectiveness. Agent Torres called Sarah at 3 a.m. on the morning of the planned attack. "Miss Chen, you need to get down to the FBI field office immediately. Your analysis just prevented what could have been the worst terrorist attack in American history." As Sarah rushed through the empty streets of Arlington, she felt a mixture of vindication and terror. Her unconventional analytical methods had identified a threat that traditional security assessments had missed, but the knowledge of how close they had come to disaster was sobering. The FBI field office was a hive of activity as agents coordinated with law enforcement agencies across the country to arrest the operatives Sarah had identified. The scale of the operation was staggering, over 30 individuals in 7 different cities, all working toward the same horrific goal. Agent Torres met Sarah at the security checkpoint, his expression reflecting the gravity of the situation. "Miss Chen, I want you to know that your analysis didn't just identify potential threats. It provided the roadmap that allowed us to dismantle an entire terrorist network. Without your work, thousands of people would have died today." The arrests were carried out with precision and coordination that reflected months of careful planning by the terrorists and days of intensive investigation by law enforcement. As the scope of the plot became clear, Sarah realized that her dismissal from reconnaissance training had ultimately led her to a position where she could use her analytical skills to achieve something far more significant than any individual field operation. But the victory came with a sobering recognition of how close the system had come to catastrophic failure. If Sarah hadn't been willing to risk her career by pursuing an unconventional analysis, if Agent Torres hadn't been willing to take her concerns seriously, if any number of small decisions had gone differently, the attack would have succeeded. The media coverage that followed described the FBI's brilliant counterterrorism work and the international cooperation that had made the arrests possible. Sarah's role in identifying the threat was mentioned only briefly and never by name. She had learned that intelligence work often meant making crucial contributions that would never be publicly acknowledged. But within the intelligence community, word of Sarah's analytical breakthrough spread quickly. The woman who had been dismissed from reconnaissance training for thinking too much had proven that sometimes thinking differently was exactly what was needed to see threats that conventional analysis missed. Dr. Vance called Sarah into her office the day after the arrests, her attitude notably different from their previous encounters. "Chen, I owe you an apology. Your analysis of the summit threat was not only correct, but potentially saved thousands of lives. I was wrong to dismiss your concerns as speculative." Sarah accepted the apology graciously, but she had already made a decision about her future. The experience had taught her that her unconventional analytical abilities were not a liability to be managed, but an asset to be leveraged. She had found her true calling not in the field operations she had originally pursued, but in the complex work of connecting dots that others couldn't see. Agent Torres offered her a position with the FBI's Intelligence Analysis Division, where her unique perspective would be valued rather than dismissed. The offer represented everything she had been working toward, a chance to use her skills in service of national security, surrounded by colleagues who appreciated unconventional thinking. As Sarah cleared out her cubicle at Meridian Defense Solutions, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. Her dismissal from reconnaissance training had felt like a devastating failure at the time, but it had ultimately led her to discover her true strengths. She had learned that expertise could take many forms, and that sometimes the most valuable intelligence came from people who saw the world differently than everyone else. The Seattle Convention Center hosted its International Energy Summit 3 weeks later, with security measures that reflected the lessons learned from the thwarted attack. As Sarah watched the news coverage of world leaders discussing the future of global energy policy, she felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that her work had made their gathering possible. She had found her place in the intelligence community, not as the field operative she had once dreamed of becoming, but as an analyst whose unconventional methods could identify threats that traditional approaches missed. It wasn't the career she had originally planned, but it was the career that suited her unique talents and allowed her to make a difference in ways she had never imagined possible. The woman who had been kicked out of reconnaissance training for thinking too much had become one of the intelligence community's most valuable analytical minds, proving that sometimes the greatest strength is the willingness to see patterns that others dismiss as impossible. The FBI Seattle field office buzzed with controlled chaos as Agent Torres coordinated the largest counterterrorism operation in the Pacific Northwest's history. Sarah found herself at the center of the storm, her analytical findings now driving real-time tactical decisions that would determine whether 37 operatives could be apprehended before they realized their network had been compromised. Special Agent in Charge Jennifer Martinez had taken personal command of the operation, her 20-year career in counterterrorism providing the experience needed to manage such a complex investigation. When she first met Sarah, Martinez's expression reflected the skepticism that had become all too familiar. Another analyst with theories that might or might not translate into actionable intelligence. "Miss Chen," Martinez said, studying the comprehensive threat assessment that had triggered the current operation. "Agent Torres tells me you identified this network through financial analysis and pattern recognition. I need to understand exactly how confident you are in these connections, because we're about to deploy significant resources based on your conclusions." Sarah had prepared for this moment, knowing that her credibility would be tested under the pressure of an active operation. She pulled up her analysis on the conference room's main display, highlighting the interconnected web of financial transactions, personnel movements, and operational preparations that had led to her conclusions. "Agent Martinez, the probability that these connections are coincidental is statistically negligible," Sarah began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what was unfolding. "The financial flows follow patterns consistent with previous terrorist financing operations. The timing of personnel placements aligns with operational requirements for a complex coordinated attack. Most significantly, the communication patterns we've intercepted since initiating surveillance confirm active planning for an imminent operation." Martinez nodded slowly, her experienced eye recognizing the quality of analysis that separated genuine intelligence from speculative theories. "What's your assessment of their current operational status? Are they aware that we're onto them?" Sarah had been monitoring the situation through FBI surveillance reports and intercepted communications for the past 18 hours. The terrorists' behavior suggested they remained unaware of the investigation, continuing their preparations with the confidence of operatives who believed their network remained secure. Based on communication intercepts from the past 6 hours, they appear to be proceeding with final preparations, Sarah replied. However, there are indicators that suggest they have contingency protocols in place. If they detect surveillance or compromise, they're likely to either accelerate their timeline or disperse to avoid capture. The challenge facing the FBI was unprecedented in its complexity. Traditional counter-terrorism operations typically focused on single cells or linear command structures. Sarah's analysis had revealed a network that operated more like a distributed corporation, with multiple independent units coordinated through sophisticated communication and logistics systems. Agent Torres had spent the morning briefing tactical teams on the unique characteristics of the threat they were facing. Unlike typical terrorist cells that relied on simple communication methods and crude operational security, this network employed counter-surveillance techniques that suggested professional training and significant resources. The sophistication level we're dealing with represents a new evolution in terrorist methodology, Torres explained to the assembled agents and analysts. They've essentially created a terrorist franchise operation, with each cell capable of independent operation, while contributing to a coordinated strategic objective. Sarah listened to the briefing with growing appreciation for the complexity of what she had uncovered. Her analytical methods had identified not just a single terrorist plot, but evidence of an organizational model that could represent the future of terrorist operations. The implications extended far beyond the immediate threat to the energy summit. The first arrests began at dawn, coordinated across multiple time zones to prevent any cell from warning the others. Sarah monitored the operations from the FBI's Tactical Operations Center, watching as her analytical predictions were validated by real-world results. The Seattle cell, which had infiltrated the convention center security and catering operations, was apprehended during what they believed was a final preparation meeting. Surveillance footage showed 5 individuals who had been planning to use their access credentials to plant explosive devices at strategic locations throughout the venue. Simultaneously, the Portland cell was arrested at a storage facility where they had been assembling the technical components needed for a sophisticated communications jamming operation. Their role had been to disrupt emergency response coordination during the attack, preventing law enforcement and medical personnel from effectively responding to the crisis. The most dangerous cell, based in Vancouver, had been responsible for procuring and preparing the explosive devices that would have been used in the attack. When Canadian authorities raided their safe house, they discovered enough military-grade explosives to level several city blocks. Sarah watched the arrests unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and sobering awareness of how close they had come to catastrophe. Each successful apprehension validated another aspect of her analysis, but also revealed new layers of the conspiracy that she hadn't fully understood when she first identified the threat. Agent Martinez approached Sarah as the final arrests were being completed. "Ms. Chen, I want you to know that your work today represents intelligence analysis at its finest. You identified a threat that our conventional methods missed, and you did it with a level of precision that allowed us to dismantle the entire network." The praise was gratifying, but Sarah was already thinking ahead to the implications of what they had discovered. The network they had disrupted represented a new model for terrorist operations, one that combined traditional cell-based organization with modern corporate management techniques. "Agent Martinez," Sarah said, "I think what we've uncovered here is bigger than just this specific plot. The organizational structure, the financial systems, the operational security measures, this looks like a template that could be replicated by other terrorist organizations." Martinez nodded grimly. "That's exactly what I'm afraid of. We need to understand how this network was constructed and how we can identify similar operations before they reach operational readiness." The debriefing process that followed would consume the next several weeks as intelligence analysts worked to understand every aspect of the disrupted network. Sarah found herself at the center of this effort, her unique analytical perspective making her invaluable in piecing together the full scope of what they had uncovered. The financial analysis revealed a sophisticated funding operation that had moved money through dozens of legitimate businesses and charitable organizations. The terrorists had essentially created a parallel economy that allowed them to fund operations while remaining invisible to traditional financial monitoring systems. The personnel analysis was equally revealing. Many of the operatives had clean backgrounds and legitimate employment histories. They had been recruited and trained over periods measured in years, not months, suggesting a level of long-term planning that challenged conventional assumptions about terrorist operations. Most disturbing was the technical analysis of their operational capabilities. The network had acquired military-grade equipment and expertise that suggested connections to state-sponsored terrorism programs. This wasn't a homegrown extremist group operating on improvised resources. This was a professionally equipped and trained organization with significant backing. Sarah's role in the investigation evolved from analytical support to strategic planning, as intelligence agencies grappled with the implications of what they had discovered. Her ability to see patterns and connections that others missed made her essential to understanding how similar networks might be identified and disrupted. The interrogation of captured operatives provided additional insights into the network's structure and methodology. Many of the individuals arrested genuinely believed they were working for legitimate businesses or charitable organizations. The network's leadership had compartmentalized operations so effectively that most participants were unaware of the true nature of their activities. This revelation highlighted another aspect of Sarah's analytical contribution: traditional counterterrorism. Efforts focused on identifying individuals with extremist ideologies or suspicious behavior patterns. But this network had succeeded by recruiting ordinary people and gradually involving them in increasingly questionable activities until they were deeply compromised. The genius of their recruitment strategy, Sarah explained during one of the daily intelligence briefings, was that they identified people with legitimate grievances or financial pressures and offered them opportunities that seemed entirely reasonable. By the time recruits realized they were involved in something illegal, they were already too compromised to withdraw. The psychological profiles of the arrested operatives supported Sarah's analysis. Many were individuals who had been struggling financially or professionally when they were first approached by recruiters. The network had provided them with steady income, professional training, and a sense of purpose that their legitimate careers had been lacking. This understanding led to a breakthrough in identifying other potential networks. Instead of looking for individuals with obvious extremist connections, intelligence agencies began focusing on recruitment patterns and organizational structures that matched the model Sarah had identified. The results were immediate and significant. Within 2 months of the Seattle operation, similar networks were identified in Chicago, Miami, and Los Angeles. Each followed the same basic template of legitimate front organizations: gradual recruitment and compromise of personnel, and long-term operational planning. Sarah's analytical methods, which had been dismissed as overthinking during her military training, had essentially revolutionized how intelligence agencies approached the identification of sophisticated terrorist networks. Her ability to see connections across multiple domains, financial, organizational, technical, and psychological, provided a holistic understanding that conventional specialized analysis had missed. But the success also brought new challenges. As Sarah's reputation within the intelligence community grew, she found herself pulled in multiple directions by agencies and organizations seeking to leverage her unique analytical capabilities. The CIA, NSA, and Department of Homeland Security all expressed interest in her services. More troubling were the attempts by foreign intelligence services to recruit her. Within weeks of the Seattle operation, Sarah began receiving sophisticated approaches from individuals who claimed to represent consulting firms or academic institutions, but who clearly had connections to foreign governments. Agent Torres, who had become something of a mentor to Sarah, warned her about the attention she was attracting. Miss Chen, your analytical methods have made you a target for recruitment by hostile intelligence services. They want to understand how you identified their network, and they want to prevent you from identifying others. The realization that her professional success had made her a target for foreign espionage was sobering. Sarah had to adjust her personal security practices and accept FBI protection, while intelligence agencies developed long-term plans for utilizing her capabilities safely. The strategic implications of Sarah's analytical breakthrough extended beyond immediate counterterrorism applications. Military intelligence agencies began examining how her methods could be applied to conventional threats, while corporate security firms sought to adapt her techniques for protecting against industrial espionage. Dr. Vance, Sarah's former supervisor at Meridian Defense Solutions, called to offer a formal apology and a significant position within their expanded analytical division. The same analytical approaches that had been dismissed as impractical were now being packaged as revolutionary new methodologies for threat assessment. Sarah politely declined the offer, having found her true calling within the FBI's analytical division. Agent Martinez had created a new unit specifically designed to leverage unconventional analytical approaches, with Sarah as its founding member and technical lead. The unit's first major assignment was to develop a comprehensive assessment of terrorist financing networks operating within the United States. Sarah's success in identifying the Seattle network through financial analysis had demonstrated the potential for disrupting terrorist operations by attacking their economic foundations rather than waiting for operational intelligence. Working with a team of financial analysts, computer specialists, and subject matter experts, Sarah began mapping the complex web of financial relationships that supported terrorist operations across the country. The scale of what they discovered was staggering. Billions of dollars moving through seemingly legitimate channels to fund activities that threaten national security. The analytical challenge was enormous. Traditional financial monitoring focused on large transactions or obvious suspicious activity. But the networks Sarah had identified operated through thousands of small transactions that appeared entirely legitimate when examined individually. Only when viewed as part of larger patterns did their true purpose become apparent. Sarah's team developed new analytical tools that could process vast amounts of financial data and identify patterns that human analysts would never notice. The techniques combined traditional intelligence analysis with advanced data science methods, creating a hybrid approach that was greater than the sum of its parts. The first major success came when they identified a network that was funding terrorist operations through a chain of small retail businesses. The individual transactions were too small to trigger conventional monitoring systems, but the aggregate pattern revealed a sophisticated money laundering operation that had been operating undetected for years. The disruption of this network led to the discovery of planned attacks on infrastructure targets across the Midwest. Once again, Sarah's analytical methods had identified threats that conventional approaches had missed, preventing potential catastrophes while they were still in the planning stages. But perhaps more importantly, her work was beginning to change how the intelligence community thought about threat identification. Instead of waiting for specific intelligence about planned attacks, agencies were learning to identify and disrupt the support networks that made such attacks possible. The transformation in Sarah's professional status was remarkable. The woman who had been dismissed from reconnaissance training for overthinking had become one of the most respected analytical minds in the intelligence community. Her methods were being studied and adapted by agencies around the world. Yet Sarah remained grounded in the lessons she had learned during her earlier struggles. She understood that her unconventional background and perspective were assets, not liabilities. The same qualities that had made her unsuitable for traditional military roles made her uniquely valuable in the complex world of modern intelligence analysis. The Energy Summit in Seattle proceeded as scheduled, with security measures that reflected the lessons learned from the thwarted attack. As Sarah watched news coverage of world leaders discussing global energy policy, she felt a deep satisfaction in knowing that her work had made their gathering possible. But she also understood that this was just the beginning. The networks they had disrupted represented a new generation of threats that required new approaches to identification and disruption. The intelligence community was still adapting to these realities, and Sarah found herself at the center of that adaptation process. The challenges ahead were enormous, but Sarah had learned to trust her analytical instincts and her ability to see patterns that others missed. The woman who had once been told she thought too much had discovered that in the modern world, thinking differently wasn't a weakness. It was exactly what was needed to stay ahead of increasingly sophisticated threats. 2 years after the Seattle operation, Sarah Chen stood before the Senate Intelligence Committee in a closed session that would reshape American counterterrorism policy. The wood-paneled hearing room in the Hart Senate Office Building was filled with some of the most powerful figures in national security, all gathered to understand how a dismissed reconnaissance trainee had revolutionized threat identification methods. Senator Patricia Hawkins, the committee chairwoman, reviewed the classified briefing materials with evident amazement. The statistics spoke for themselves. Since implementing Sarah's analytical methodologies, intelligence agencies had identified and disrupted 47 terrorist networks, prevented 12 major attacks, and fundamentally altered the landscape of domestic security operations. "Ms. Chen," Senator Hawkins began, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had overseen national security policy for over 2 decades. "Your unconventional approach to intelligence analysis has produced results that frankly exceed what we thought possible. Can you explain to this committee how someone with no formal intelligence training developed methods that our most experienced analysts had overlooked?" Sarah had learned to navigate these high-level briefings with the same methodical approach she applied to analytical problems. She understood that political leaders needed to comprehend not just what her methods accomplished, but why traditional approaches had failed to identify the same threats. "Senator Hawkins, I believe my effectiveness stems from approaching intelligence analysis as an outsider rather than working within established frameworks," Sarah explained, displaying a complex network diagram on the committee's secure monitors. "Traditional intelligence analysis tends to focus on specific threat categories or geographical regions. My background taught me to look for patterns that cross those conventional boundaries." The network diagram showed connections between seemingly unrelated incidents across multiple continents. What appeared to be isolated terrorist attacks, financial crimes, and political disturbances were revealed to be components of a coordinated campaign designed to destabilize democratic institutions worldwide. Senator Robert Marshall, the committee's ranking member, leaned forward with obvious skepticism. "Ms. Chen, this level of coordination suggests resources and planning capabilities that exceed what we've traditionally attributed to terrorist organizations. Are you suggesting that our fundamental assumptions about these threats have been incorrect?" Sarah had anticipated this question, knowing that her conclusions challenged decades of counterterrorism doctrine. The evidence she had compiled over the past 2 years painted a picture of terrorist evolution that was both sophisticated and deeply troubling. "Senator Marshall, the networks we've identified operate more like multinational corporations than traditional terrorist cells," Sarah replied, switching to a new display that showed organizational charts resembling those of major international businesses. "They have research and development divisions, human resources departments, financial planning operations, and strategic planning capabilities that rival legitimate corporations." The implications were staggering. Instead of the loose confederations of extremists that intelligence agencies had been trained to identify, Sarah had discovered integrated organizations that could adapt, learn, and evolve in response to counterterrorism efforts. Director James Morrison of the CIA had been unusually quiet during the briefing. But now he spoke with the gravity of someone who understood the strategic implications of Sarah's findings. "Miss Chen, if your analysis is correct, it suggests that we're not just fighting individual terrorist groups, but rather confronting a new form of asymmetric warfare that challenges our entire approach to national security." Sarah nodded, appreciating Director Morrison's recognition of the broader significance. "Director Morrison, that's exactly right. These organizations have learned to exploit the seams between different intelligence agencies and jurisdictions. They understand our bureaucratic limitations better than we understand their operational capabilities." The discussion that followed would influence American intelligence policy for the next decade. Sarah's analytical methods had not only identified specific threats, but had revealed fundamental weaknesses in how democratic societies approached security challenges. Senator Hawkins requested a private briefing on the most sensitive aspects of Sarah's discoveries. In a secure conference room, Sarah presented evidence of terrorist networks that had infiltrated not just private companies, but government agencies and military contractors. "The most troubling aspect of what we've uncovered," Sarah explained, "is that these networks have been operating undetected for years, possibly decades. They've had time to study our methods, understand our vulnerabilities, and develop countermeasures that specifically exploit our institutional blind spots." The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records showed terrorist organizations investing in legitimate businesses specifically to gain access to sensitive information and influence political processes. Personnel records revealed patterns of recruitment and placement that suggested systematic infiltration of critical infrastructure sectors. Senator Hawkins studied the classified documents with growing alarm. "Ms. Chen, you're describing a level of strategic planning that suggests state sponsorship. Are we dealing with traditional terrorist organizations or something more sophisticated?" Sarah had wrestled with this question throughout her investigation. The evidence pointed to something unprecedented: terrorist organizations that had evolved beyond their original ideological constraints to become sophisticated actors capable of strategic thinking and long-term planning. "Senator, I believe we're seeing the emergence of what I would call post-ideological terrorism," Sarah explained. "These organizations maintain their extremist rhetoric for recruitment purposes, but their actual operations are driven by strategic objectives that transcend traditional ideological boundaries." The concept was revolutionary. Instead of groups motivated primarily by religious or political extremism, Sarah had identified organizations that used extremist ideology as a tool while pursuing sophisticated, strategic objectives that included economic disruption, political destabilization, and technological theft. The briefing concluded with Senator Hawkins requesting that Sarah develop a comprehensive strategy for adapting American intelligence capabilities to address these evolved threats. It was an assignment that would require her to think beyond analytical methods and consider fundamental questions about how democratic societies could defend themselves against such sophisticated adversaries. Over the following months, Sarah worked with a team of experts from across the intelligence community to develop what would become known as the Chen Doctrine, a comprehensive approach to identifying and disrupting sophisticated terrorist networks before they reached operational capability. The doctrine represented a fundamental shift from reactive to proactive intelligence operations. Instead of waiting for specific threat indicators, agencies would systematically map and monitor the infrastructure that supported terrorist operations: financial networks, recruitment systems, communication channels, and logistical support mechanisms. Agent Torres, who had become Sarah's closest collaborator within the FBI, helped coordinate the implementation of these new methodologies across multiple agencies. The organizational challenges were enormous, requiring unprecedented cooperation between traditionally competitive intelligence organizations. "Sarah," Torres said during one of their regular coordination meetings, "what you've accomplished goes beyond improving intelligence analysis. You've essentially created a new framework for understanding how modern threats evolve and operate. The implementation of the Chen doctrine produced immediate results. Within 6 months, intelligence agencies had identified and disrupted terrorist networks in 15 countries, prevented attacks on critical infrastructure in 8 major cities, and uncovered evidence of terrorist infiltration in dozens of sensitive organizations. But the success also brought new challenges. Foreign intelligence services began developing countermeasures specifically designed to defeat Sarah's analytical methods. State sponsors of terrorism invested heavily in understanding and exploiting weaknesses in the new American approaches. Sarah found herself at the center of an intelligence arms race, constantly adapting her methods to stay ahead of adversaries who were specifically targeting her techniques. The pressure was enormous, but it also validated the significance of what she had accomplished. The personal cost of her success was substantial. Sarah's work required the highest levels of security clearance and protection, effectively isolating her from normal social relationships. Her analytical insights had made her one of the most valuable intelligence assets in American history, but also one of the most targeted. Dr. Elizabeth Reeves, a psychiatrist who specialized in supporting intelligence personnel, helped Sarah navigate the psychological challenges of her unique position. Sarah, you've essentially become a human strategic asset. The isolation you're experiencing is unfortunately necessary, but we need to ensure it doesn't compromise your analytical effectiveness. Sarah appreciated Dr. Reeves' understanding of her situation. Few people could comprehend the psychological pressure of knowing that terrorist organizations around the world were specifically studying her methods and looking for ways to exploit her analytical blind spots. The breakthrough that would define the next phase of Sarah's career came when she identified a pattern that suggested terrorist organizations were beginning to adopt artificial intelligence and machine learning technologies. The implications were profound. Adversaries who could automate the processes that Sarah had developed manually. Working with computer scientists from the National Security Agency, Sarah began developing automated analytical systems that could process vast amounts of data and identify threat patterns without human intervention. The project, codenamed Minerva, represented the next evolution in intelligence analysis. Minerva's first operational test produced results that exceeded even Sarah's optimistic projections. The system identified 17 terrorist networks that human analysts had missed, predicted 3 attack plans with sufficient detail to enable preemptive disruption, and mapped financial networks that spanned 43 countries. But the real breakthrough came when Minerva identified a pattern that suggested terrorist organizations were planning a coordinated, global campaign designed to simultaneously disrupt democratic elections in multiple countries. The scope and sophistication of the operation challenged every assumption about terrorist capabilities. Sarah presented her findings to a joint session of intelligence directors from allied nations. The international cooperation required to address this threat would test the limits of diplomatic and intelligence relationships that had been decades in the making. Directors, Sarah began, addressing representatives from 15 countries. What we're facing represents an evolution in asymmetric warfare that transcends traditional national security frameworks. These organizations have learned to exploit the boundaries between our jurisdictions and the limitations of our coordination mechanisms. The evidence she presented was compelling but also deeply disturbing. Terrorist organizations had essentially created a shadow international system that paralleled legitimate diplomatic and economic relationships. They had their own communication networks, financial systems, and even rudimentary intelligence services. Director Morrison spoke for the assembled intelligence leaders. Ms. Chen, you're describing a level of organizational sophistication that suggests these groups pose an existential threat to democratic governance itself. What do you recommend? Sarah had prepared for this question, knowing that her response would influence international security policy for years to come. Directors, I believe we need to fundamentally reconceptualize how we approach these threats. We're not fighting terrorist organizations in the traditional sense. We're confronting a parallel civilization that exists specifically to undermine our own. The recommendation she presented was as ambitious as it was necessary: the creation of an international intelligence consortium that could operate across traditional boundaries and jurisdictions. The proposal challenged fundamental assumptions about national sovereignty and intelligence sharing, but the alternative was continued vulnerability to increasingly sophisticated threats. The months that followed saw intense negotiations as allied nations worked to establish the framework for unprecedented intelligence cooperation. Sarah found herself serving not just as an analyst, but as an architect of new international security relationships. The International Threat Assessment Consortium, established with Sarah as its founding analytical director, represented a new model for democratic cooperation in the face of evolving security challenges. The organization could track threats across national boundaries, share intelligence in real time, and coordinate responses with a speed and efficiency that traditional diplomatic channels couldn't match. The consortium's first major operation validated Sarah's strategic vision. Working together, member nations identified and disrupted a coordinated terrorist campaign that would have targeted elections in 12 countries simultaneously. The operation required coordination between intelligence agencies that had never worked together before, but the results demonstrated the potential for this new approach. Sarah watched the operation unfold from the consortium's coordination center in Brussels. Surrounded by analysts and operatives from dozens of countries working together toward a common objective. It was a far cry from the isolation she had experienced as a dismissed reconnaissance trainee, but it represented the logical evolution of everything she had learned about identifying and disrupting sophisticated threats. The success of the election protection operation established the consortium as a permanent fixture in international security architecture. Sarah's analytical methods, which had once been dismissed as overthinking, had become the foundation for a new model of democratic cooperation and defense. But perhaps more importantly, the consortium became a platform for identifying and developing unconventional analytical talent from around the world. Sarah insisted that the organization actively recruit individuals with non-traditional backgrounds, understanding that the most valuable insights often came from unexpected sources. The consortium's talent development program identified and trained hundreds of analysts who brought unique perspectives to intelligence challenges. Former journalists, academics, business executives, and even artists found their skills translated into valuable analytical capabilities when properly channeled and supported. Sarah's own journey from dismissed military trainee to international intelligence leader became a template for recognizing and developing unconventional talent. The program she established identified individuals whose thinking patterns didn't fit traditional molds, but who possessed the analytical capabilities needed to address modern security challenges. The transformation was remarkable. Within 5 years of the Seattle operation, Sarah had not only revolutionized intelligence analysis but had created institutional frameworks that would continue evolving and adapting long after her direct involvement ended. But the most satisfying aspect of her success was the opportunity to mentor others who had experienced similar struggles with institutional recognition. Sarah regularly spoke at military academies and intelligence training programs, sharing her story and encouraging students to trust their unconventional insights. During one such presentation at Fort Sentinel, the same facility where she had been dismissed from reconnaissance training, Sarah addressed a mixed audience of instructors and students. The irony was not lost on anyone present, including several instructors who had participated in her original evaluation. "The most important lesson I can share," Sarah told the assembled audience, "is that expertise can take many forms. The qualities that make someone unsuitable for one role might make them uniquely valuable in another. The key is recognizing that different doesn't necessarily mean deficient. The response from students was overwhelming. Many approached her afterward to share their own experiences with being told they didn't fit expected molds, or that their thinking patterns were unsuitable for military service. Sarah made a point of connecting these individuals with opportunities that could leverage their unique capabilities. Colonel Martinez, who had replaced Captain Rodriguez as the Reconnaissance Program Director, approached Sarah after her presentation. "Miss Chen, I want you to know that your success has changed how we evaluate candidates for this program. We've learned to value analytical depth and unconventional thinking as assets rather than liabilities." The acknowledgement was gratifying. But Sarah was more interested in ensuring that future students wouldn't face the same institutional blindness she had encountered. She worked with military education administrators to develop new evaluation criteria that could identify and nurture unconventional talent rather than screening it out. The changes she influenced extended far beyond military training programs. Intelligence agencies, law enforcement organizations, and even private sector security firms began adapting their recruitment and training practices to identify individuals whose thinking patterns didn't fit traditional molds, but who possessed valuable analytical capabilities. Sarah's story became required reading in leadership development programs across multiple government agencies. The woman who had been dismissed for thinking too much had proven that organizational success often depended on recognizing and leveraging exactly those qualities that conventional wisdom considered problematic. The international recognition of Sarah's contributions culminated in an invitation to address the United Nations Security Council on the evolving nature of international security threats. Standing before representatives of the world's most powerful nations, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her from a rain-soaked training ground to the center of global security policy. "Distinguished delegates," she began, "the threats we face today require us to fundamentally reconsider how we identify and develop the human capabilities needed to address them. The most valuable insights often come from individuals whose perspectives don't fit conventional expectations." Her presentation to the Security Council established new international standards for intelligence cooperation and threat assessment. The methodology she had developed became the key foundation for a global approach to identifying and disrupting sophisticated terrorist networks before they could operational capability. But beyond the policy implications, Sarah's story resonated with individuals around the world who had struggled with institutional recognition of their unique capabilities. She received thousands of messages from people who had been told they didn't fit expected molds, many of whom found inspiration in Kodakums, her example to persist in developing their unconventional talents. The Chen Institute for Analytical Innovation, established 5 years after the Seattle operation, became a focal point for research into unconventional intelligence methods and talent development. The institute attracted researchers and practitioners from around the world, all working to understand how different thinking patterns could be channeled into valuable analytical capabilities. Sarah's work at the institute focused on developing automated systems that could identify potential analytical talent based on cognitive patterns rather than traditional credentials. The research challenged fundamental assumptions about how intelligence capabilities could be recognized and developed. The Institute's first major breakthrough came when they identified a correlation between certain types of pattern recognition abilities and success in modern intelligence analysis. The discovery led to new screening methods that could identify potential analysts from diverse backgrounds and non-traditional educational paths. More significantly, the research revealed that many of the qualities that made individuals unsuitable for traditional military or intelligence roles, attention to detail, unconventional thinking patterns, willingness to question established assumptions, were exactly the capabilities needed to address modern security challenges. Sarah often reflected on the irony that her dismissal from reconnaissance training had ultimately led her to make contributions that far exceeded what she could have accomplished as a field operative. Her journey demonstrated that sometimes the most valuable service came not from following expected paths, but from finding ways to leverage unique capabilities in service of larger objectives. The woman who had once been told she thought too much had proven that in an increasingly complex world, the ability to think differently wasn't a liability. It was exactly what democratic societies needed to defend themselves against sophisticated and evolving threats. As Sarah looked toward the future from her office at the Chen Institute, surrounded by analysts and researchers from around the world working to address emerging security challenges, she understood that her greatest contribution hadn't been any single analytical breakthrough, but rather the demonstration that expertise could come from unexpected sources and that organizational success often depended on recognizing and nurturing exactly those qualities that conventional wisdom considered problematic. The dismissed reconnaissance trainee had become not just a successful intelligence analyst but a catalyst for institutional change that would continue influencing how democratic societies identified and developed the human capabilities needed to address evolving threats for generations to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.